everyone. My name is Sarah Lynne Bowman, and I am from the Transformative Play Initiative at the Department of Game Design at Uppsala University. Today, we're going to give a little introduction to tabletop role-playing games. So what is a role-playing game? A role-playing game is the enactment of a character in a co-created fictional world. There's this creation of this magic circle of play where the social and physical rules of reality differ from those of daily life temporarily. Sometimes props and costumes may exist within this world, but the fiction exists mostly in the minds of the participants, and that's a term we call subjective diegesis. The audience members are also the participants and the co-creators, which means that role-playing has a first-person audience, meaning that it's not performed for an external audience. It's performed for the people that are actually participating in it. And while fantasy, science fiction, and post-apocalyptic fiction are common, role-playing games can be any genre, setting, or theme. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that with regard to tabletop role-playing games today. So there are three main types of role-playing games, also called RPGs. There are virtual or digital role-playing games. These can be text-based or graphical, but they generally use a computer interface, and they can also be single or multiplayer. There's tabletop role-playing, which is what we're going to focus on today, which is usually played sitting at a table, sometimes with dice, character sheets, miniatures. It's less physical and more verbal. And then live action role-playing, or LARP, is a physically embodied form of role-playing, sometimes has costumes, props, and special locations, but not always. So I'm going to make a bold statement here and say that you have probably played a role-playing game or something like it before. So there's several cousin forms of tabletop role-playing games that I want to talk to you about today. So the first is childhood pretend play. And this is something that many of us have either experienced or witnessed children in play. And it's a spontaneous co-creative expression based on emergent playfulness. And that sometimes includes an enactment of a role. So it tends to involve comparatively loose frameworks for rules and characters, and it instead focuses on emergent imagination. So whatever comes to mind at the time. It's sometimes enacted alone. For example, having an imaginary friend interacting with a being that arises from our imagination. A transitional object, which is imbuing inanimate objects with some sort of magical powers, consciousness, personality traits, or other special qualities. There are things called paracosms, where people create imaginary worlds. And then there's identity play, where children imagine the self as someone else, for example, Batman or another character that they admire. And all of these things will come into play, as we'll see, with tabletop role-playing games. Here we have a picture of Calvin and Hobbes, the famous cartoon. And we learn throughout the cartoon that Hobbes, who is this tiger, they're bouncing on this tree as they're playing. Hobbes is actually his imaginary friend and a transitional object that he has projected consciousness into. So childhood pretend play is sometimes enacted in groups. And in these groups, people are often enacting roles in specific sets of circumstances. So social games, in other words. So some games can include things like chase play, tag, hide and go seek, domestic play like playing house, professional play like playing school, cops and robbers, which is sort of a mixture of chase play and professional play, but it has a moral connotation. And here we have an image of some kids playing cops and robbers for Halloween. And then dark play, whether consensual or non-consensual. So play is not always positive, and it's not always beneficial for everyone. Sometimes there's bullying, for example, can be considered a type of play. And so I'd like to talk to you next about board games and card games. And I'm going to put those under the broader category of board games because I think all of these things I'm about to talk about for the most part apply to both. And these are strategy games that are usually played at a table. So board games can be collaborative, for example, Pandemic, or they can be competitive, for example, Monopoly. They sometimes use randomizers like dice in order to add an element of chance. They often have objects that physically represent characters, items, and locations. So for example, playing cards, miniature figurines, tokens, terrain. And while extensive role playing during a board game or a card game is not very common, there may be a role that's associated with the player's actions. For example, here we have a picture of Miss Scarlet in the murder mystery game Clue. And this is the 1986 version of Miss Scarlet. And she also has this red token that is associated with her that you can move around the board. You might be playing in the game Diplomacy, the country of Russia, the diplomat connected to Russia. You may be playing a green planeswalker wizard in Magic the Gathering, or you may be playing a trainer in the Pokemon card game. So even if the focus is on the mechanics and the gameplay, one can still be enacting some form of role, and often we are invited to do so by these games. And so there are a lot of skill-focused games, which emphasize displaying skills such as, for example, remembering facts, like Trivial Pursuit is a game that asks us to remember facts on the spot. Solving puzzles like Mahjong. Improvising communication with a partner, for example, Pictionary, where you can only use pictures and drawings to communicate, and you have to somehow figure out what each other are trying to say. Counting cards and counting tricks, for example, in the card game Bridge. And then various forms of social maneuvering, for example, the game Werewolf, where you have to hide if you're the werewolf or not, or you have to try to figure out who the werewolf is. And there are also resource gathering board games, and these focus upon gathering resources, for example, land, wealth, treasure, or allies, resources of all sorts. And some famous ones include Settlers of Catan and the Game of Life. And here on the page, we have an image of the Game of Life, where we have these moves that you spin the spinner in order to see what your number is, and you get to make that many moves. And sometimes you gain money, sometimes you gain a spouse, sometimes you get a good big promotion. And so it's this gamification really of the benchmarks that people are supposed to hit in traditional society. So it's a quite interesting game with regard to thinking about who we are as humans, what's expected of us, and how that's being represented mechanically, not only in the game, but also in our daily lives. And then there are simulations, and these are games that are intended to play out specific scenarios for training purposes. So this is more on the professional end of things rather than board games for fun, let's say. So some examples include healthcare, government, and first responder training. So anybody who's in one of those professions oftentimes will have to do some sort of training, for example, bedside manner in healthcare, or learning how to deal with an epidemic if you're in the government, learning how to handle an emergency, a crisis, if you're a first responder. And probably the most widespread use of this is actually in the military. So there's all sorts of military simulations out there. Sometimes they're abstracted, like tabletop games are, and other times they're physically embodied, like LARPs are. So for example, people might be practicing how to use a weapon or other kinds of technology. They may be managing resources. They may be simulating battles. They might be practicing medical triage. Sometimes they even create these little cities, these little mini cities, and they'll communicate with actors that are playing the locals, quote unquote, in a specific territory. And here we have a military simulation that looks a lot like a board game. And this is from the US Army Command. And here we have American, Czech, and Bangladeshi military leaders that are playing a game called Land Power. So in short, role-playing is a human thing, and it takes many forms. It may include character embodiment, community building rituals, interactive storytelling, fiction writing, puzzles and problem solving, and/or symbolic enactment. And we'll get a bit more into symbolism in a while here. So, in terms of role-playing games specifically, I've said that there are three main functions of role-playing games. The first is community creation. So, for example, ritually enacting the game together is a form of creating community. Skill training, so scenario building, problem solving, practicing pro-social behaviors, these kinds of things. And also identity exploration. So, for example, exploring an alternative gender expression. And so a question that a lot of people like to ask is, where did role-playing games come from, since they are so similar to all these other kinds of forms? And so what we're going to focus on here is, how did tabletop role-playing games as we know them today emerge? And the locus point for that is really Dungeons and Dragons in 1974, which was a game by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. And it was heavily influenced by many different sources, but specifically the two main ones that I focus on are Conan the Barbarian by Robert E. Howard. And here you can see a picture of Conan towering over a bunch of bloody bodies with a scantily clad woman next to him. And this is imagery, very famous imagery by Frank Frazetta. And Conan is sort of this, hardcore warrior who is quite powerful in his prowess. And then we have The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. And here's an image from the movies. And as you can see, there are a lot more characters being featured here, because it really is about this fellowship, meaning this group of people that together, all of their skill sets are going to be needed in order to fight evil, in this case, the quote unquote other. And so you have wizards, you have halflings, as they'll be called in D&D, you have elves, you have orcs and goblins, and a lot of the traditional, we call them races, although that's not the best word for them. They really should be called species in terms of the way they're used in D&D. But a lot of the aspects of Dungeons and Dragons came from Lord of the Rings, although the authors did not want to admit that for a long time. So Dungeons and Dragons had a lot of tendrils that sort of led up to it. So many of these Gygax and Arneson were actually involved in at the time. So there's this overlap between the development of D&D and other kind of cultural emergences, as John Peterson and Aaron Trammell have written in their work. So for example, the wargaming community, both of those people were very, very heavily involved in a role-playing, or I should say wargaming group. And they were experimenting a little bit with role-playing, but for the most part, it looked like what you see here, which is different armies on a battlefield facing each other. And there'd be a lot of rolling of dice and counting points to see, how each faction of the army does. This is Hordes and Heroes Fantasy Miniatures by Callistra Limited. But there's all different kinds of miniatures out there and war games out there. So they were also involved in diplomacy games with in-character correspondence. So diplomacy is a board game technically, but it has a lot of role-playing elements because you're playing diplomats trying to convince each other to be allies. And sometimes, of course, that people are not honest about their intentions. And so this in-character correspondence becomes really important when we start thinking about role enactment. Also military simulations. The wargaming community was actually connected to the RAND Corporation, who was building military simulations for the US Air Force. So there was a direct correlation between simulations and the developing of role-playing games, actually. And then also during this time arose the Society for Creative Anachronism, called SCA, and other kinds of reenactment groups. These groups do not call themselves LARPs, but they do dress up in costuming and often go by a different character name and have, specific ways in which they address each other and kind of create a shared fiction. So it is very similar to a LARP, even if they don't prefer not to call it that. And also during this time, improvisational theater was becoming a big thing. And actually, Gary Gygax was, I believe, part of an improv troupe, if I'm not mistaken. So all of these different trends make it possible for D&D to emerge. And D&D, for the most part, is facilitated by a game master who describes events and officiates actions, often via dice-based resolution mechanics. And what that means is there's these randomizers that the dice create, or other kinds of mechanics create, that allow for people to have an element of chance, perhaps an element of fairness towards their play. So for example, if I'm trying to persuade the bartender of something, my character is, but I'm not very good at persuasion myself. If I have a high persuasion skill and I roll that die and I get a very good score, then the game master, who's the one that's sort of in charge of running this world, will interpret my behavior as if I have performed very well, even if I personally have not. And so this is true for lots of different actions. It could be something social, like what I just described, or it could be, combat. Oftentimes mechanics are attached to combat in these games. And so in Dungeons and Dragons, they had these specific characters that they were enacting. So if you think about the war game and you think about the generals that were in charge of those different groups, they started embodying the characters and role-playing as those generals. And so this is kind of a similar principle, except it's more like the Fellowship in Lord of the Rings, where you're embodying each of the characters within that adventuring party. And these characters, for the most part, are meant to collaborate with each other. Of course, players being who they are, sometimes they may choose to do something different with the characters, but for the most part, you're working together towards a shared goal. And so you may be exploring maps. So for example, dungeons and other fictional locations. You may be interacting with other fictional characters within this world. You may be solving puzzles or planning tactics. And this is especially true for battle. So it might be very helpful to have a cleric in the party who can heal, because if everybody can fight but nobody can heal, then you might be in trouble, these kinds of things. Oftentimes enacting violence is a central theme in these games. It doesn't have to be, but it certainly focuses very heavily in the rules and in the setting. You actually get mechanical advantage for enacting violence successfully. So you may gather treasure or quote unquote loot. You might level up and become more powerful because you have more experience points based on this violence that's been enacted. So there certainly is a strong mechanical incentive, and even the setting itself is very geared towards combat. And here we have an image from Dragon of Ice Spear Peak, which is a Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition adventure. And this is a warrior, looks like casting a spell on a frost dragon. and a member of their party is holding out a hand, perhaps in caution, or maybe to help, or maybe to hinder. It's hard to say. Okay, so tabletop role-playing games often contain actions that are described in the third person around a table, although sometimes they are enacted in the first person. So what this means is instead of me physically moving my body like I would in a LARP and performing an action, I might be describing that action in the third person. Like my character, Vivian, goes to talk to the barkeep. So that's third person. She goes to talk to the barkeep. Or I might say, I go to talk to the barkeep. And oftentimes you'll have people slipping in and out of this first person and third person in tabletop games. Character sheets with scores for abilities are really common. Mechanics to represent combat and other skills, dice or other types of conflict resolution systems that are often randomized, as I've mentioned before. Adventures and quests, which are often played over the course of several game sessions and grouped into what are called campaigns in Dungeons and Dragons. They're called chronicles in the World of Darkness, seasons in Fate system. So there's different ways to think about these different groupings of play sessions. But the idea is that you're not going to play just one game, probably. It takes quite a bit of time to set up these characters and to build them and to create relations and to explore this world. And so some people play the same group their entire life. So the same D&D group for, basically until they die, which is kind of sweet to have that kind of companionship out of game and in game. Others may only play a handful of sessions, and that's just fine. As I said, violence tends to be a central component, and then puzzles and problem solving and strategy are also often there. So if somebody's trying to get out of a dungeon, perhaps they have to solve a puzzle in order to figure out how to get out. And this is similar to a puzzle room, which has become really huge these days, which are, these rooms with a bunch of different puzzles, word puzzles and numeric puzzles and moving objects and things like that in order to get out of the room. This is very clearly inspired in a lot of ways from Dungeons and Dragons. So you'll have this faction of characters that have these collective goals, and you'll have individual characters that have specific abilities, but also specific limitations. And then again, this emphasis on characters leveling over time, which basically means that there are win conditions and lose conditions to this game. Even though it's a form of free-form role-playing game in a way, in the sense that the players can take it in certain directions if they want to. Likely the game master is going to move them in a certain direction in order to get them to the next fight, for example, or the next plot point. And there are certain ways that they can be successful. And here, in terms of traditional role-playing games, this is Steve Jackson's GURPS, which is a generic universal role-playing system. So it's a very, very complex mechanical set of rules that was created to basically help people in any setting, any genre, create a role-playing game. And so in the image here, we have, looks like a knight that's heading towards a castle. We have spaceships in the sky. We have planets and galaxies. So we have a mixture of settings being represented visually here. Now, there are other traditional tabletop role-playing games that are a little bit different. So we've been talking a little bit about fantasy. There's also science fiction and superheroes, but there's also horror and post-apocalyptic games. And so these games tend to focus on characters devolving over time rather than just improving, particularly in the horror genre. So the characters still might be leveling because this is a traditional tabletop game. They still might be gaining experience and skills and all of that, but there's something going on that is making it difficult for them psychologically. And that's actually rendered usually through mechanics as well. And so a game that came out fairly shortly after Dungeons and Dragons is Call of Cthulhu, which is a cosmic horror RPG by Sandy Peterson for the publishing company Chaosium. And this game is based on the works of H.P. Lovecraft, who was an author who wrote a bunch of horror stories about this massive, or the series of massive elder gods, the primary one being Cthulhu. And you can see, I believe, Cthulhu featured here, rising from the sea, and this tiny little investigator with a tiny little torch looking up at this massive creature. So this is cosmic horror, the sense of being completely insignificant in the face of something that you can't make sense of. It literally drives you mad to look at it. And so while characters may succeed in certain actions, any engagement with the plot will cause characters in Call of Cthulhu to, quote unquote, lose their sanity, because they're being exposed to these vastly powerful, malevolent entities. And that means that defeat is highly probable and sometimes inevitable in these games. So that's a little bit different from something like Dungeons and Dragons, where you can literally become a god if your character gets high enough level. Here, the god is always going to be stronger than you, no matter what. And then we have the World of Darkness set of games, and there are many of them. I'm just going to cover a couple of them. And these focus upon flawed characters that are experiencing some form of personal horror within a dangerous, corrupted world that resembles our own. So they're taking elements of the quote unquote real world, and they're amplifying them and adding supernatural elements to them. So there's a strong sense of social commentary that's embedded in the World of Darkness games and of realism, even though we have these supernatural abilities with these characters. And so similarly to Cthulhu, instead of clear-cut heroes, the characters represent some aspect of the monstrous. So for example, in Vampire the Masquerade, the struggle is to maintain one's humanity while feasting as an immortal parasite and navigating Machiavellian politics. So there's this tension there. And in Werewolf the Apocalypse, werewolves are very tied to the earth, to the mother spirit of Gaia. So the struggle is to try to preserve the soul of the earth from corruption while managing their all-consuming rage within them, which can be quite destructive. And in Mage the Ascension, the struggle is to avoid megalomania and destruction while also bending reality to one's will. So these are the kinds of internal struggles that these characters face. There are also external struggles and foes and enemies and things like that. But this gives an example of the ways in which in these role-playing, even in traditional role-playing games, we have a little bit of a sense of playing to lose, as we would call it in the Nordic LARP tradition. Now, people don't always play it that way, meaning that they may play it as some people call it, superheroes with fangs, when they refer to Vampire the Masquerade, meaning that if the setting says it's a game of personal horror, but the rules are all about how to be powerful, then that's the game that people are likely going to play, is how do I become more powerful, rather than maybe emphasizing these themes as much as the authors would like. That's part of the deal with role-playing games. People can take it in whatever direction they want. So here we have an image of a tarot card of the mage, the magician, and this is looks like a son of ether, which is a specific type of mage who's using technology in order to access magic. And this is the cover art for the original Mage the Ascension book. Okay, so now we're going to transition to talk a little bit about indie tabletop role-playing games. Now, like traditional games, I'm only going to cover a couple of them. So I'm by no means going to covering the width and breadth of everything that's out there. And I'm mostly focusing on American role-playing games. But there are some communities that were really interested in discussing theory, really interested in developing new strategies to create games that were fulfilling for them. rec.games.frp.advocacy in the olden days when we were on mailing lists on the internet, that developed into the Forge forum and what we call the story games diaspora, meaning people that were really interested in games that were focused on narrative. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we move along, and all the different places where they ended up on the internet. And then there's also game conventions that would hold like games on demand, you know, specifically for indie role-playing games. And you can find these kinds of things at places like PAX Unplugged, Dreamation, Origins, when those conventions are running. So, you know, you have the traditional role-playing games, which are still going very strong. Dungeons and Dragons is hugely popular right now, especially with people on TikTok and on Twitch. So, you know, it's still the most known role-playing game, and certainly the most played role-playing game. But then you have all these sort of new experimental indie games that start developing, particularly in the late 1990s and 2000s, and they've been flourishing in the last 10 years. So they tend to have stripped down mechanics, and you know, this is hugely generalizing, but for the most part, there's this emphasis on focusing on telling an interesting story rather than whether characters are going to quote unquote win or lose. And we sometimes call this story games. Now, that's not to say that traditional role-playing games don't tell stories. Of course they do, but the emphasis is often, you know, defeating the foe or winning the battle rather than how the story unfolds. And sometimes it might be more interesting if the character doesn't defeat the foe, then what happens, that sort of thing. There's also this distribution of creative agency in indie role-playing games that's very interesting. So this is allowing many players to have ownership of the narrative world and the characters within it, not just the game master. So in traditional role-playing games, the game master is responsible for all the rules, the world, all the characters within the world. So if I say, I'm going to go talk to the barkeep, that person, the game master, has to invent a barkeep, whether they've thought about that or not. So there's a lot of improvisation and a lot of pre-planning that goes into being a game master in traditional role-playing games. This is not the case so much in story games. There's this real interest in just playing with whatever creative energy is at the table and distributed amongst the different players. And so there may even be a GM-less game where everybody's sort of responsible for filling in certain aspects of play. Here we have the Fate core system book, and this is a system for any genre similar to GURPS, but much more stripped down mechanics, emphasizing story, that sort of thing. And that's by Evil Hat Productions. So I'm going to emphasize 3 games for you today, but they really are sort of, I think, representative of a lot of different games out there. And so, but they're by no means the only games that you should think about with regard to indie tabletop. But I think they were hugely influential, and they've really shifted what we think about a tabletop role-playing game, what it even is. The first is Fiasco by Jason Morningstar from Bully Pulpit Games. And he describes this game as a game of powerful ambition and poor impulse control. So people who really want to do things that are powerful, but they aren't very good at controlling their impulses. So that means that they're likely to fail. And so he was inspired by cinematic tales of small-time capers gone disastrously wrong. So for example, Coen Brothers films figure heavily like Fargo. And there's lots of different play sets for Fiasco because they created several of their own, meaning different settings where it can take place. And then fans started creating their own settings. I've created a couple just on the fly myself. So it's very much a community, the indie tabletop community that really encourages co-creation with the people that are consuming these games, who are creators themselves. So unlike traditional role-playing games, Fiasco is sort of like designed in opposition, I would say, in a lot of ways. It's designed to be a one-shot rather than a long-term campaign, meaning that it's designed to only be played in one night over the course of maybe 3 or 4 hours. It's a game in which characters' actions tend to fail horribly, as I said, and this is usually due to hubris or greed or ineptitude or something like that. So you're not intended to succeed at slaying the dragon. Even if you're playing in a Dungeons and Dragons themed Fiasco set, your character is likely to cut his own arm off accidentally rather than slay the dragon. And, it tends to be a comedic tone rather than this heroic tone or even horror tone that we've been talking about. So it uses dice in very interesting ways, but it mainly only uses them to convey little randomized bits of story. So what you'll get in these play sets is certain settings and certain character relations and objects, and you'll have dice from 1 to 6, and then whatever you roll, you attach that piece of fiction that's tied to that. Let's say you roll a 1, there's a piece of fiction that says 1 is the king's bedchamber. Okay, well, that's where this particular setting is going to take place. Okay, so that's part of the world that we're creating. So that's a very different way to use dice. It's not there to see whether you succeed or not. It's there to sort of randomize story elements and throw them into the mix. And then also the dice are used towards the end in order to see how badly everybody messes up their lives. So instead of just see how triumphant they are, very rarely do they have that kind of response. Oftentimes they have various levels of unpleasant, untimely ends. And so in this way, it very much subverts the expectations of traditional role-playing games. It has a lot of the same feeling of a traditional game, but it changes everything up. Similarly, I think one of the most important games that has been written is Apocalypse World. And I think it's specifically important because of how incredibly influential it has been on hundreds of creators out there. This is a game by D. Vincent Baker and later McWay Baker, who helped to create this world, but also, of course, the play testers and various people who've been involved in discussing Apocalypse World, because Fiasco, Apocalypse World, they all came out of these very vibrant discourse traditions. I was talking about the Forge earlier and story games. These were locations where people would go and talk about role-playing theory. And so these indie games were sort of coming out of this discussion of what traditional tabletop role-playing is good at, what is not satisfying about it, and what we can do differently based on the interests of those people, of course. Some people love traditional games, and that's great. But Apocalypse World was designed with, again, stripped down mechanics and certain moves, but only a few that emphasize the telling of an interesting story. So instead of memorizing a list of 100 spells that your wizard in Dungeons and Dragons can do, you have a maximum of maybe 3 to 5 moves that your character in Apocalypse World can do. And the focus is on the collaborative creativity of the group. So the game master directs the flow of the story as usual, but it's always based on the character's actions and also even out of character conversations with the players. So the game master may say, hey, what cool thing would you like to see happen today? And then they might weave that into the story as a result. So it's very much player-driven and character-driven game. The focus is on survival and relationships. So there's this strong sense of lethality for all the characters. Now, in early Dungeons and Dragons, there was a sense of lethality, and there are gamers who play in that sort of old school style and are very interested in it. And that group is called the Old School Renaissance, because in the early Dungeons and Dragons games, your character could die very, very easily. They were very fragile characters. So this is similar to that. But for the most part, later editions of these role-playing games make it harder and harder for characters to die, because there's all sorts of ways to revive them or to intercede. And so Apocalypse World is meant to feel gritty and for these characters to feel quite fragile. So they have to really connect with one another in order to survive. And that those relationships become an important emphasis, to the point where there's actually mechanics for sex in this game, which was very controversial at the time. So what emerged from Apocalypse World is this open source game engine, which they called Powered by the Apocalypse. And hundreds of games have been designed based upon this foundation. So similar to the way that Fiasco, there have been hundreds of play sets that have been created. Similarly with Powered by the Apocalypse, because it is open source, people can create their own setting and their own rules, and it's all fine. And it's part of this larger community. So there's many games, but I'm just going to bring up a couple here. So there's Dungeon World by Sage Latora and Adam Koebel. And Dungeon World is like Dungeons and Dragons, but it's with this Apocalypse World type engine, meaning that you don't have a ton of spells. You maybe have a handful, and it's really focused on, an emerging story rather than an adventure in the strict sense. And then two of my favorites are Monster Hearts and Dream Askew by Avery Alder. And these are games that take some of these themes and use them in very interesting ways. So Monster Hearts takes this Powered by the Apocalypse system and then creates a bunch of teenage monsters similar to Twilight or Monsters, Inc. And they are going to high school and experiencing their monsterness. And each one of them are having their awakening into being a monster. And this is meant to be a metaphor for queer identity. And so it's a really powerful game, humorous oftentimes. And then also Dream Askew, which is very similar to Apocalypse World, except it's focused on a queer community. So people that are outside of the survivors that are normally featured in these, apocalypse settings, these, super badass type of characters, who may be coded straight, for example, or who fit in, let's just say, with the mold, whatever that is in this apocalyptic world. Dream Askew focuses on people outside that, people in the margins, and how they interrelate. And one of the things I find really interesting about Dream Askew is that it focuses on mechanics that incentivize intimacy and vulnerability. So you have to spend a token, for example, to do something really cool, like, oh, I, shoot that guy, or oh, I managed to make this really cool contraption. But you actually gain tokens back for sharing vulnerably about your feelings, or assisting other people in various other ways that community is built. So the emphasis and the incentivization here is on community building rather than violence, which I find quite interesting. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about Itras By by Martin Bull Gudmundsson and Ole Peter Jäver. This is a game based on the 1920s surrealism movement, which is one of my favorites in all of art. And so the setting is very dreamlike and very unpredictable. So even if you wanted to have a sort of traditional adventure in this world, chances are there's things morphing and changing just like they do in a dream all the time. So again, we have these stripped down mechanics, but this time we're focusing specifically on improvisation techniques. So in Itras By, there's a set of cards that you draw. And if you decide to take an action, you pull a card, and the card gives you a new bit of fiction. So it's like a yes, but, or a yes, and, or a no, and. So not only do you not do that, and this other thing happens. And it's quite interesting as a storytelling device that's sort of baked into these cards. And then the players are the ones that interpret the results of these cards rather than a game master, which again emphasizes the co-creative agency that the players have over the story in these kinds of story games. And so Itras By not only subverts expectations of RPGs in terms of having these ambiguous quote unquote win conditions, if you can call it that, the win is really the experience itself, but also just in terms of the tangibility of reality and the linearity of time. I mean, we're talking about a very discombobulating setting with Itras By, but also quite sweet in a lot of ways. So here we have an image from a supplement called The Menagerie. This is Surrealism Now by Li Qin. And it is a person on a unicycle who is holding a flying clock and flying above a city that is moving in lots of different directions. So, some takeaways. Tabletop role-playing games are similar to other forms of playfulness, games, and simulations. They widely vary in terms of their themes and mechanics. They are hugely influential, especially on the structures of other games, particularly things that are called role-playing games in virtual worlds, such as computer RPGs, single-player RPGs, and MMORPGs, which are these multiplayer online games that millions of people play. They use similar mechanics and leveling structures to basic Dungeons and Dragons, just more complex. And it's always evolving into new and experimental forms. So here is my reference list, and I'll also link that in the description. And again, my name is Sarah Lynne Bowman from the Transformative Play Initiative. Thank you very much.